Okay, welcome to the ethics of UBI. We are discussing today several topics, beginning with Philip Pettit's Republican case for basic income, which Driton Ibishi will be presenting. Go ahead, Driton.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Today we have a new point of view arguing in favor of UBI, and that is the Republican view. More exactly, it's Philippe Pettit's paper, A Republican Right to Basic Income. He tries to make a case and argues that basic income should be a right and republicanism favors such a thing. So before going deeper into Pettit's article, I will first provide some groundwork as to what republicanism is. We know that liberalism is highly concerned with individual freedom and sees freedom as in the sort of non-interference. Republicanism, on the other hand, is a distinct type of liberalism in the sense that the way of looking at the meaning of freedom for the individual is in terms of non-domination. So it's a way of seeing liberalism from the point of view of power structures in the society. Basically, this is the main concept of Pettit's argument in this paper. Now, I'm confident that all of us already know what a UBI is, so I won't get into that. But as we've seen from our discussions in the seminar, the establishment of such a right has raised so many questions regarding, for instance, institutional feasibility, labor market, and so on. Pettit also points this out. So in the introduction section, Pettit asks, even when there aren't any problems with such concerns, as I just mentioned, could a society of mutually reciprocal equal status society members accept a constitution that allows some members to do this, namely the establishment of basic income as a right? And he goes on to argue that these obstacles can be overcome. In the article, he discusses some issues with the utilitarian and liberal perspectives as to not being a sufficiently satisfactory argument for basic income. And that is due to the two desiderata or requirements that he lays down that make up for justifying basic income, given that there are no problems arising with establishing such a right. First, the first desideratum is the adequacy. As he puts it, the argument should establish a right to an intuitively adequate level of income. Say it should be, for instance, above the poverty level. So it should be an appropriate level. And the second one is the desideratum of independence, which means that the argument for UBI, for a basic income, should establish a claim that a basic income cannot become invalid and it shouldn't be stigmatizing. Pettit thinks that the Republican view on basic income provides for a better argument which captures these two requirements in a way that other alternatives do not, namely the utilitarian view or other liberal arguments. So what's wrong with the utilitarian and liberal perspective in justifying a UBI? The issue, according to Pettit, is that utilitarianism provides a basic income by happy accident, as he puts it, because it justifies policies to the extent that they yield the optimal result. And the problem with that is that people wouldn't enjoy a UBI as a right, UBI as a right. Insofar the desideratum of adequacy is concerned, utilitarianism is kind of shaky in satisfying it due to the outcome-oriented approach. Now, let's talk about liberalism. Liberalism, on the other hand, tries to maximize at least basic liberties by reducing or eliminating forms of intervention or interference. The liberals' task would now be to demonstrate that a UBI is required to prevent outside intervention. But why would that be the case? For instance, a poor and a needy person's right to non-interference might be violated if they are left to perish of famine, for instance. Van Parijs attempts to provide a liberal solution to this issue by claiming that there is no significant difference between purposeful obstruction by others that infringe on a person's rights and unintended obstruction to freedom, which could be natural, such as natural disaster. The UBI, he claims, can also assist alleviating the latter type of hindrance, obstruction, and as such can be justified under liberalism. But Pettit contends that treating unintended limitations as bad in a way which are seen as bad as purposeful interference is unrealistic. As he puts it, if someone stands in my way, that's a different sort of challenge to my liberty than the challenge provided by the tree that has fallen in my path. He goes on to argue that if the rights are supposed to be freedom-based, it is quite conceivable to provide people with rights against willfully inflicted harm by others. But it is less reasonable to do so to provide people with rights against unfortunate twists of destiny. He considers the liberal approach to be unconvincing by this passage. But what about republicanism? Can republicanism build a case for UBI? To understand Pettit's Republican approach, first requires to understand the distinction notion of freedom. According to Pettit, the fundamental difference between Republican and the liberal point of view is that Republicanism defines freedom as the absence of a certain type of dominating control, whereas the liberalism point of view defines it as the absence of interference from any other parties. So to be dominated means that you're controlled by the desires or preferences of another person. For instance, control means that another person, say, for example, Karl, controls me when their presence in my life increases the likelihood of my acting in accordance with their preferences. Pettit differentiates reasoned control, such as advice giving, and unreasoned, such as slave master control. The Republican view holds that to achieve freedom as non-domination, we must first eliminate all causes of dominating control. And one frequent critique of republicanism is that there is no real distinction between non-interference and non-domination. But Pettit contends that there is, and in fact, one can be free of interference while still being dominated. As an example, I will use myself and Karl. If Driton, if myself is not interfered, I am free according to the liberal definition of freedom as non-interference. However, assuming that on a need basis, approach, someone, say Karl, is in a position to interfere in any of the ways that can cause me to behave in accordance to their preferences. And from this point of view, am I really free? And Pettit argues that no, if my behavior deviates from the predefined pattern, Karl may feel compelled to constrain me in doing so and put me back in the pattern. In that case, Karl can structurally and institutionally dominate me, even if there is no reason for Karl to actively interfere. He exerts control by monitoring my behavior in order to interfere when necessary, and only when necessary. In that case, I can only act with Karl's permission, or con permiso. Moreover, Karl is within his rights to do so. And thus, if I am not guaranteed a basic income, Karl can meddle with me without facing legal barriers. And moral of this story and whole this republicanism view is that the Republican view holds that freedom is not a matter strictly constrained to non-interference, but also an institutional matter and power structures. My discussion demonstrates that, of course, Pettit's discussion, in fact, demonstrates that there is a strong Republican argument for a universal basic income. But nevertheless, it seems that a UBI, a basic income, is transferring dependency, say, for instance, between worker and employer with another one, between the state and the individual. So society members now will rely on the state to take care of the basic economic needs, which puts them in a similar situation as they were before. This is the end of my discussion and presentation.
Okay, I want to build on, can everybody hear me okay? I'm not using headphones today. I'm using external speakers, so I want to make sure everything's fine. Okay, I want to build on what Driton was saying because I want to make sure that everybody appreciates what republicanism is and what republicanism is and how it relates to liberalism, and in order to understand this debate. This is really important. I'm really glad we're talking about this paper because we have not until now talked about civic republicanism at all. The most important thing to know about civic republicanism, which is its original name is republicanism, and it goes back, it traces its origin at least as far as ancient Rome. And some of Aristotle's arguments can be considered civic republican arguments. These days, it's always been called republicanism, or at least since the early modern period, it's been called republicanism. Recently, we've added the word civic in front of it to distinguish it from the Republican Party in the United States, which is not a civic Republican Party in any way, shape, or form. There is no relationship between the contemporary Republican Party and this idea of civic republicanism. It has nothing to do with this party that's called Republican. It does have a little bit to do with the Republicans in Barcelona. And in Spain as a general, mostly in the Barcelona area, in Catalonia, but in Spain in general, there is a real Republican tradition, as there is in Ireland, to some extent in other places in Europe, but it's pretty small. Now, Driton said something that I think is fair, but it is something that almost all Republicans would reject, all civic Republicans would reject, that it is a distinct type of liberalism, is what he said. And I can see why you say that, because it is talked about rights of individuals and limited government, which are the things that liberals define as the essence of liberalism. You could think of it as a distinct type of liberalism. But to Republicans, especially Spanish Republicans, liberalism is a bad word. And they don't want to think of themselves as a distinct type of liberalism, but actually an older tradition. The liberal tradition really only goes back as far as John Locke. You can extend some concepts further, especially to Hobbes, but really you don't get something that's really kind of blowing up into the liberal theory until you get to John Locke, and it doesn't get a name until the 1800s. So they like to think of themselves as distinct. They're smaller, and they like to think of themselves in opposition to this big prevailing liberal theory. So you will immediately anger them if you say that they're a distinct type of liberals, even though there is actually a case you could make for that. So they define freedom as non-domination. Or another way to put it is the freedom from arbitrary interference. When someone else has arbitrary power over you, they make you unfree whether they exercise that power or not. And this is one way to draw a big distinction between liberals and civic Republicans. For a civic Republican to have that non-arbitrary, non-dominating freedom, you have to have a democracy. To be free is to live under the laws that you and your neighbors got together and decided are reasonable. The laws are non-arbitrary. They single out no specific groups for any special duties and no specific groups for any special privileges. Whereas liberalism is having a set of rights. It doesn't talk about what the power structures are, except to say, well, a democratic power structure might deliver rights to you better than a non-democratic power structure. But as long as they deliver you the same set of rights, you're just as free. And so there were a group of liberals led by they're known as the Chicago Boys, led by people like Milton Friedman, who went down to Chile after the 1973 coup, where, with backing of the CIA, Salvador Allende was overthrown, and Augusto Pinochet, whose name is pronounced in French, even though he was Chilean. It's a long story. Some people call him Pinochet, but actually he called himself Pinochet because he had some French origin. The Pinochet regime got advice from these economists from the University of Chicago that said, well, look, if you have these economic rights and those economics and these other economic rights, you can be dictator and the people can be free. Well, in this University of Chicago understanding of freedom, they were free. But in the civic Republican sense, where there's a dictator who could at any moment have you arrested, he only had a few people arrested, but he did have people arrested. That puts a chill over everybody else's behavior. And that, to the Republicans, that is what Driton was talking about, that potential to interfere. Even if it is never acted upon, that potential to interfere is hugely important. Now, this gets into the marketplace. If you put individuals in a position where the person at the top could interfere with them in an arbitrary way, then all the individuals are losing this Republican sense of freedom as non-domination. They are dominated even if the boss doesn't do it. It doesn't interfere with them at all. And I think we're getting into feminism today, so I might as well use this example. The Me Too movement, it came out a few years ago, really illustrates this dominating power in the workforce. Harvey Weinstein, the American film producer and director, had so much power over the women who worked under him that he could say, you have sex with me or you're off the film. And he didn't do that to all the women, but he did that to a lot of the women. So all of the women were under this constant fear that maybe I'm going to have to have sex with Harvey Weinstein or give up my career. And he would follow them. He not only had power when they worked on his movie, but he was so powerful in Hollywood, he could call up other producers, his competition, and say, oh, she's difficult. Oh, don't work with her. And he destroyed women's careers. Every woman in Hollywood at this time knew this was happening. So you had to avoid being alone with Harvey Weinstein so he couldn't hit on you, or you had to have sex with Harvey Weinstein, or you had to be the ugly woman and play the woman parts of ugly parts so Harvey Weinstein wouldn't want to have sex with you. Those were your options. That is dominating power. And Republicans are worried about this in the workplace, not just for really exceptional guys like Harvey Weinstein, but for everyday employers. Let's say we have big unemployment and you go to the workplace. there's large unemployment, so you could be replaced at any moment, then the boss can screw around with you. Oh, you don't like this job, huh? You don't like this job. Okay, well, I'll just replace you with somebody else. They're in a big position to screw around with you. That could come out as sexual harassment. That could come out as racial harassment. That could come out in a myriad of other ways. Or maybe the boss is a really nice guy. And it never comes out, but it's always there if you have this sort of relationship. So Pettit's Republican argument for basic income is that basic income can reduce that dominating power. It's not going to make it go away. It wouldn't make it go away in Hollywood. I mean, if those, women who are trying to get into a multi-million-dollar movie had a basic income, that's not going to change their movie career, but it will help those many ordinary people in those jobs where they might face domination. That's, I think, the essence of his argument. So let's discuss that a bit. What do y'all think of this? This might be a new concept to you. That probably some of you have never heard about freedom as non-domination. So we can discuss that as a meaningful concept of freedom. Does it add a lot to the liberal concept of freedom that I'm sure you're all familiar with? And how does it distinctly relate to basic income in Pettit's argument? So what do you all say? Feel free to put your hands up electronically or physically. Driton, do you want to follow up on anything I just said?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I must say that it's fairly new because we didn't discuss the Republican view previously in the class, and I must say that I really liked it. I mean, it's my preferred case in favor of basic income. And I ask for forgiveness if I meddled with those in Barcelona that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I hope nobody gets offended if I did say anything wrong. So yeah, that's it.
Okay, let me also, I'll add a few things. So I thought there was something strange in this article. And you'll notice this is not the only article that does this. You'll notice this when you read philosophy. Philosophy is supposed to be like you have these base principles. These principles are really important to you. And then policy follows from the principle. You're building the policy on the principle. So you should be arguing why these principles are so important and then what policies follow from them. And you follow those principles toward whatever policy you want. But part of the argument in this article is backwards, where he says, hey, basic income supporters, you like basic income. Well, actually, Republican principles give you a stronger argument for basic income than a lot of the liberal principles you've been using. You should become Republicans. But that's arguing from policy to principle when the argument is supposed to be from principle to policy. The argument's backwards. That's like, I mean, this guy's one of the top philosophers. He's at Princeton. He's one of the people responsible for this revival of civic Republican thinking. And here he is with a backwards argument. Here comes my dog. There she goes. Yeah. Okay. So now, then another issue that I have with this is that it is distinct from, there is some overlap with my independentarian argument. When I'm saying, I want people to be independent from that boss, that is very much like freedom from the boss's arbitrary power. However, what civic Republicans don't worry about is non-arbitrary power. Well, if you and your fellow citizens get together and say there will be a work requirement, that is considered non-arbitrary because that's you and your fellow citizens getting together and deciding what rules you want to live under and creating a work requirement for everyone. I'm suspicious that that is true freedom, because the idea of dissenters and things like that. That is one problem I have with this republicanism. But another thing is that market power doesn't have to be dominating to be problematic. So let's say instead of this big amount of unemployment, like I was talking about when I talked about an ordinary employer having dominating power over you, let's say we have a perfectly competitive market that works perfectly. Supply meets demand. There is in the labor market, there is zero unemployment. But the wages at that intersection of the supply and demand, the wages are really low, so that you will live in poverty. If you just take a going wage job, you'll probably have to get 2 jobs to keep yourself in a home. But the boss has no power over it. And I remember working as a dishwasher when I was in high school with some other guy who was unable to get a better job. I guess he had some learning difficulties or something, but he was a dishwasher, was his job. And he said, if I walked up here one day and this place had just blown up and it's just a smoldering mass of ruins, I wouldn't care a bit. I'd just walk down the street and get another dishwashing job somewhere else. No dominating power when you can do that, but he was living in poverty in a world that so devalued his skills that any job he could get, even if they couldn't dominate him, was a job in poverty. And that the Republicans don't give you a reason to believe that that's wrong. And I think that points out a weakness in their theory, when I believe that something's really wrong there. If you're taking advantage, if our society is structured so in a non-arbitrary sense, we're still taking advantage of this person's labor. So that I think there's a lot of good in this republicanism. And I think that they're right to say we should live under the laws that we and our neighbors think are reasonable. But I also don't think that this concern with nothing but arbitrary domination goes far enough. Yeah. Driton, do you want to follow up on my second round of remarks here?
I actually don't have anything more to say, but you are right. There are a couple of things that don't go very far, like the example you mentioned with the dish washing example. Yeah, it became a concern in our previous discussion. This dishwashing example. I mean, you're totally right. It doesn't work properly for them. But when you think about it, it also comes down to the businesses. I mean, the restaurants, for instance. I mean, they are the ones who bear the most of the risk. They are the one who have their capital invested, and you basically when you're working there, you're not taking any risk on it. So it's basically the other party who has invested it and who is invested their capital and bears most of the risk, or at least all of the risk maybe. So we have to think in this way from both sides, not only from the workers' perspective but also from the other part.
And that's bringing up an entirely new issue. Okay, now Benedict.
But that implies that wage or return on investment, or however you earn money, is always, positively correlated with the risk you take. And I think that's just not the case. There are so many people who take low risks and get high income because they grow up privileged. You realize what I'm saying, Driton, right? There's that assumes like perfect meritocracy and perfect return on investment. You know what I mean? It's sort of.
Yeah, I think you're going a bit far to say that his comments rely on perfect meritocracy. It does rely on there being some level of meritocracy, but I don't think it relies. at least some level of merit being involved with people who do some of the people who do investing. I don't think it needs to be perfect for his comments to make any sense.
Fair enough. That was a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, yeah, that's true.
But that does get us a little bit off of republicanism and into this like market freedom idea. So I don't want to go down there too far.